Hey everyone, my name's William, and I honestly never thought I'd end up writing something like this. I've read plenty of stories here about entitled parents and spoiled siblings, but I always figured mine were just a little overbearing, not full-on delusional. Turns out I was wrong. To understand what happened on my 27th birthday, you need to know the kind of household I grew up in. My parents, especially my dad, always favored my younger brother, Ethan. He's 23 now and has never worked a stable job for more than a few months at a time. Every time he quits, there's always an excuse. His boss was unfair, his coworkers were lazy, or the job was beneath him. My parents buy every word of it. Meanwhile, I've been working since I was 16. I paid for my own college, bought my own car at 21, and even helped with bills a few times when Dad's business hit rough patches. I never made a big deal out of it. That's just how I was raised. To be responsible, to pull my own weight. Or at least, that's what they told me growing up. Funny thing is, that rule only ever applied to me. Ethan, on the other hand, could crash his car into a mailbox and somehow get rewarded for it. I'm not exaggerating. He once backed into the neighbor's fence, blamed it on the poor visibility, and my parents actually bought him a new car. Still, I tried to keep my distance from the family drama after moving out 3 years ago. I focused on work, saved money, and fixed up my own place. I visited occasionally, usually on holidays or birthdays, to keep the peace. Which brings me to last weekend, my 27th birthday. Mom called a week before to say they were planning a small celebration at the house. I hesitated because these celebrations always somehow turned into Ethan-centered events, but I figured, whatever. It was just dinner. I could survive one evening. When I got there, everything seemed normal at first. The table was set. There was a store-bought cake, which already told me Mom hadn't exactly gone all out, and Dad was grilling in the backyard. Ethan wasn't around, which I silently appreciated. Mom hugged me and said, "I can't believe my oldest is 27 already. You're such a grown man now." She said it with that smile that never quite reached her eyes, the same one she used when she wanted something. Dinner was fine. We talked about my job, how things were going, and Mom even seemed genuinely interested for a while. But when Ethan finally showed up halfway through dessert, the energy in the room shifted. He walked in all confident, like he owned the place, with his phone in his hand and that smug grin that made my teeth clench. "Hey everyone," he said, plopping down next to Mom. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was insane." Dad chuckled. "No problem, son. We were just talking about how your new job's going." That was news to me. Last I heard, Ethan had quit another office job 2 months ago. He leaned back and said, "Yeah, I start next week. Sales position. Big opportunity. But I need reliable transportation this time. The old car's done for." Mom glanced at Dad, then at me. That's when my stomach dropped. I didn't know why yet, but something about the way they were looking at me told me I wasn't going to like what came next. Dad cleared his throat. "That's actually something we wanted to talk to you about, Will. You know your car, the Honda you bought a few years ago." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, what about it?" Mom folded her hands together. "Well, Ethan's going to need something dependable for his job. He can't afford a new car right now, and we know you work close to home. So, we were thinking maybe you could let him use yours for a while." I blinked, thinking I must have misheard. "You want me to lend Ethan my car?" Dad shook his head. "Not lend, son. It makes more sense for it to be his now. You can use Mom's old sedan in the meantime. It's just sitting in the driveway." For a few seconds, I couldn't even process it. My own car, something I worked for, maintained, insured, and paid off, was suddenly being reassigned like it was a shared household item. I laughed, thinking it was some twisted joke. "You're serious?" Mom sighed. "William, you've always been practical. You don't need something fancy. Ethan needs it for his career. It's just how family helps each other." I felt my jaw tighten. "That car isn't fancy, it's reliable. Because I made it that way. I paid for it. Not you, not Dad, and definitely not Ethan." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Relax, man. It's just a car. I'll take good care of it." That's when I realized this wasn't just about a car. It was about control. They'd done this my whole life, taken what was mine and handed it to him with a smile. I stood up, pushing my chair back. "No, that's not happening." Dad's expression hardened immediately. "Don't talk to your mother like that. We already made the decision. The car's in the family's name anyway." That part hit me like a brick. I'd bought the car myself, but years ago, when I was younger and still trusting, Dad had helped with the registration paperwork. I never thought twice about it. I clenched my fists under the table. You're kidding me. You put it in your name, Mom said softly. It was just easier for insurance at the time. You were still living here. Ethan smirked. Guess that means it's Dad's call, huh? Something in me snapped right then, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. The kind of breaking that makes everything afterward feel crystal clear. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just said, all right. If that's how it is, fine. Dad nodded like he'd just handled the situation. Glad you understand. Family helps family. Mom smiled in relief. You'll thank us later. Ethan grinned wider. Appreciate it, bro. I didn't respond. I just walked out. But before I left the house that night, I made one quick stop in the garage. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying the scene at dinner in my head. The smug look on Ethan's face, Mom's patronizing tone, Dad's calm finality when he said, we already made the decision. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about every single time they'd taken something from me and justified it under the excuse of family. When I was 12, Dad gave Ethan my bike because you're too old for it anyway. When I was 16, Mom used the money I'd saved from mowing lawns to buy Ethan a gaming console to keep him occupied. In college, I worked 2 part-time jobs while Ethan dropped out of one semester and was praised for taking time to find himself. And now, after years of trying to earn their respect, they were trying to strip me of the one thing I truly owned. Something inside me shifted that night. It wasn't anger exactly, more like cold clarity. I realized that reasoning with them never worked because they didn't see me as an equal. To them, I was the dependable one, the one who could be relied on, manipulated, and guilted into compliance. Ethan was the fragile one, the project they always needed to help. But I wasn't going to play that role anymore. So while they were still inside talking about how well everything went, I walked into the garage. It was quiet except for the faint hum of the old freezer by the door. The fluorescent light flickered above me, and my Honda sat there, spotless as always, the last thing in this house that still felt like mine. I opened the trunk and took a long look at everything I'd stored there. My tool kit, jumper cables, a first aid box, a small emergency kit I'd put together years ago. All things I'd bought with my own money. I started pulling them out one by one, setting them aside neatly. Then I lifted the hood and disconnected the battery. It wasn't drastic, not yet. Just enough that the car wouldn't start. But as I stared at the engine, I had a thought. A dangerous, satisfying one. See, my dad always bragged about being mechanically gifted, but he rarely touched his tools unless it was to show off. I, on the other hand, actually knew what I was doing. I'd maintained that car religiously, replaced parts myself, even upgraded the interior over the years. If they wanted to claim it as theirs, I figured they could have it, just not in the way they expected. I won't say exactly what I did that night, not yet, anyway, but let's just say the car they thought they were handing over wasn't the same one sitting in the garage when I left. It wasn't damaged exactly, more like altered. And I made sure it was altered in a way that would make a very clear statement once Dad tried to show it off, or when Ethan tried to start it up. Before I left, I placed the keys on the workbench next to the toolbox. And then I took one last look around. The walls were lined with Dad's dusty trophies from when he used to race cars in his 20s. He still talked about those days like they defined him, even though they were decades behind him. I wondered if that's why he resented me, because I'd actually made something of myself while he just clung to old glory. I closed the garage door quietly and drove off in Mom's old sedan. The one she said was just sitting in the driveway. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was leaving in the same car she'd offered me as a consolation prize. When I got home, I turned off my phone. I needed space. I didn't want to hear their excuses, not yet. I spent the night cleaning my apartment, trying to shake off the adrenaline. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's face when he'd said, "You'll thank us later." Morning came, and the call started. At first, it was Mom. Her voice on the voicemail sounded half panicked, half scolding. "William, what did you do to the car? Your father's in the garage, and he says something's wrong. Please call us back immediately." Then Ethan's texts started rolling in. "Very funny, man. What did you do to it? Dad's mad. He says you tampered with something. Seriously, you're acting like a child. You should be happy to help your brother." I didn't reply. Around 10 a.m., Dad called. This time, I picked up. His voice was low, controlled, the way it always was when he was trying not to yell. "William, I went to check the car this morning. Care to explain what you did?" I said calmly. You said it was yours now. Maybe you should figure it out. There was silence for a moment. Then he said, you always have to make things difficult, don't you? We do everything for this family, and this is how you repay us. I almost laughed. You do everything for Ethan, Dad. Let's not pretend otherwise. Your brother is starting a career. He needs help. You've always been the one we could count on to be mature about these things. Mature, I repeated. That's your word for compliant, isn't it? Watch your tone, he snapped. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall. You know what, Dad? You can keep the car. I don't even care anymore. But don't call it a gift when you're just taking it from me, because your favorite can't take responsibility. You're being dramatic, he said. Ethan's trying. He's not like you. He just needs a little more support. That was the final push I needed to hang up. About an hour later, Mom texted me again. Your father's upset. Ethan's job starts tomorrow, and now he doesn't have transportation. I hope you're proud of yourself. I didn't respond to that one either. By noon, I got another text, this one from Ethan. I don't know what you did, but Dad's furious. He said it's going to cost a lot to fix. You better come fix it yourself before things get worse. That one made me smile, just a little, because that was exactly the point. See, what Dad didn't know, and what Ethan would soon find out, is that I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd simply reverted it. I'd taken back everything I personally installed, every upgrade, every modification that made that car worth driving. The original parts one replaced were long gone, so when I removed mine, I left it bare. Functioning, but incomplete. It would take Dad days to even realize what was missing, and weeks to fix it if he wanted it back to how it was. But I knew he wouldn't pay a mechanic. He'd try to do it himself, out of pride. And when he did, he'd see my handiwork. Because inside the engine compartment, beneath where I'd left everything spotless, was a note taped in plain sight. It said, "Family helps family." You said it yourself. I don't know if he's read it yet, but judging by Mom's increasingly frantic messages, I'd say they've found it. Now, the real fallout's beginning. My aunt texted me earlier saying Mom's been calling everyone in the family, trying to paint me as ungrateful and unstable. Apparently, Dad's embarrassed because the neighbors overheard him yelling in the garage this morning. Ethan's threatening to take legal action, which is funny because he doesn't have the faintest clue what that even means. But what's most interesting is the sudden quiet from Dad after that last call. No more lectures. No more guilt trips. Just silence. And that silence tells me he's not just angry. He's thinking. He's realizing I'm not the obedient son he can push around anymore. And that's where things are now. I haven't gone back to their house since. They still think I'm sitting here waiting for them to come to their senses, but I'm not. I'm done waiting for them to treat me like family when they've never acted like it. Still, something tells me this story isn't over yet. Because Mom just texted again, this time, not with guilt, but with something that sounds almost like desperation. She wrote, "Please, William, you need to come home. Your father wants to talk. It's about the garage." That last part made my stomach drop because I know exactly what else was in that garage, and it wasn't just the car. When Mom texted saying Dad wanted to talk about the garage, I hesitated for hours before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore her entirely, just to let them sit with whatever shock they were experiencing. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what exactly had them so shaken. So, after pacing around my apartment for half the afternoon, I finally texted back, "What about the garage?" Her reply came almost instantly. "You know what? Please come home. Your father needs to speak to you in person." That line, "in person," told me everything I needed to know. Whatever they found wasn't something they wanted to discuss over the phone. And knowing my dad, if it was serious enough for him to ask me to come home, it had to be something that hit him where it hurt. Still, I didn't want to go unprepared. I packed a small bag, grabbed a few documents I might need, including proof of car ownership, insurance, and the receipts from all the upgrades I'd bought with my own money, and drove back to their house around 6 in the evening. The sun was setting by the time I pulled into the driveway, and for a moment, the sight of the old brick house made something in me twist. I'd grown up here. Every inch of the place used to feel like safety. Now it just looked like a stage for the same old performance I'd spent years trying to leave behind. The first thing I noticed was the garage door. It was half open, like someone had given up midway through trying to close it. The light inside was on. I parked the sedan at the curb and walked up slowly. Mom was standing near the door, arms crossed, her face pale and drawn. "William, she said when she saw me, relief flooding her expression. Thank goodness. Your father's been waiting for you. I didn't answer. I just stepped past her and into the garage. Dad was there, sitting on the workbench stool, staring down at something in front of him. Ethan was pacing behind him, muttering under his breath. When I stepped closer, I saw what had them both rattled. It wasn't the car this time. It was the old steel lockbox sitting on the floor, the one that used to belong to my grandfather. I hadn't seen that thing in years. Dad always kept it under his workbench, saying it held important family documents. I used to believe that. Then, one afternoon when I was about 16, I'd caught a glimpse of what was actually inside. A thick envelope of cash, a few old watches, and a folder marked inheritance. Dad had snapped the box shut before I could see more and told me to mind my own business. He said it was family money from Grandpa's estate, something he'd handle when the time came. I never asked again, but I never forgot it either. Now, the box was open. The contents were spread out across the table, and one look at Dad's face told me he wasn't just angry. He was scared. What did you do? He asked quietly, without even looking up. I crossed my arms. You'll have to be more specific. He pointed toward the table. You took things out of this box. You had no right. I frowned. No, I didn't touch that. It was sitting under the bench when I left. Ethan scoffed. Yeah, right. You expect us to believe that? The money's gone, Will. I blinked. The money. Dad finally looked at me, his jaw tight. There was $5,000 in cash in that box. Now it's missing. My heart sank for half a second, not because I'd taken it, but because I instantly knew what had happened. I turned to Ethan. You took it. He stepped forward, eyes narrowing. You don't get to accuse me, man. You're the one who's been sneaking around here messing with things. I shook my head. You probably needed it for your new job, didn't you? Enough. Dad barked, slamming his palm on the table. Both of you stop. William, if you took that money as some kind of revenge. I cut him off. I didn't. You can check my apartment, my car, wherever you want. I don't have your money, but I'd bet good money Ethan does. Ethan scoffed again, but avoided my eyes. Mom wrung her hands nervously. Let's not turn this into another fight. Maybe it's just misplaced. Dad glared at me. Nothing is misplaced. Someone took it, and since you're the one who decided to alter things in my garage last night, you'll understand why I'm asking you first. That word, alter, made my lips twitch. He had no idea how much that word gave away. He'd clearly looked at the car more closely since this morning. I shrugged. Check the security footage, Dad. He froze. What footage? I tilted my head toward the small black camera mounted above the garage door. That one. You installed it 2 years ago, remember? Said you needed to keep an eye on your tools. The color drained from his face. Ethan turned to him. Wait, there's a camera in here. Dad muttered something under his breath and turned toward the workbench computer where he kept the footage. After a few clicks, the screen flickered to life, showing last night's timestamp. For the next few minutes, the room was filled with the hum of the old computer as the grainy footage played. It showed me walking into the garage, disconnecting the car battery, moving some things around, and then leaving. That was it. No sign of the lockbox being touched. I folded my arms and looked at Dad. Satisfied. He didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, his jaw clenching tighter with every passing second. Finally, he said quietly, Then where's the money? I think you should ask your other son, I said. Ethan bristled. You're unbelievable. Always blaming me for everything. You think you're so perfect. I stared at him evenly. I don't think I'm perfect. I just think I've had enough of cleaning up after you. That hit a nerve. He lunged forward, his voice rising. You ruined my chance at this job. You sabotaged the car. I didn't move. No, Ethan. I took back what I bought. You didn't lose anything that wasn't handed to you. Dad stood between us, his hand raised. That's enough. Both of you. Mom stepped forward, her voice trembling. Please, stop this. We can figure it out together. But I was done figuring things out for them. I turned toward the car, the silver Honda that had started this entire mess. It sat there in perfect stillness, clean and quiet. I could see the note still taped inside the engine compartment, right where I'd left it. Dad must have seen it too, because when he caught me looking, his face darkened. He said coldly, You think you're clever, don't you? I met his gaze. No, Dad. I just think I'm finally free. I started walking toward the door, but he said something that made me stop. If you walk out that door, William, don't expect to come back. You're not part of this family if you can't act like one. I turned slowly to face him. You mean if I don't let you take whatever you want from me? Then yeah, I guess I'm not. Mom let out a small sob. Please, William, don't do this. But I was already halfway to my car. I got in, closed the door, and sat there for a moment, staring at the house through the windshield. That's when I saw it. Through the garage window, Ethan was talking to Dad, gesturing wildly toward the lockbox. Dad said something, then pointed sharply toward the car. Ethan froze, his expression changing from defensive to alarmed. And then, in a strange twist of irony, Dad turned toward the security camera and reached up to unplug it. That's when I realized he wasn't trying to find the truth anymore. He was trying to hide it. I don't know what exactly they're planning, but I do know one thing. Whatever they found or lost in that garage, it's tearing them apart from the inside. And I haven't even told them the full extent of what I actually did. Because that alteration I made to the car wasn't just mechanical. It was something much deeper, something tied to that inheritance box, to Grandpa's so-called family money, and to the one secret my dad never thought I knew. I hadn't meant to use it against him. Not at first. But after everything that's happened, I'm starting to think maybe it's time. After I left that night, I didn't just drive away angry and hope for the best. I went straight to the place I'd been spending evenings for the last several months. A little rented storage unit I'd kept for tools and projects. And more importantly, a private place where I could organize things without someone barging in and saying I was being dramatic. I've always been practical, remember? Planning felt like the adult thing to do. Here's what I had been collecting, bit by bit, in case anyone was wondering how I pulled something like this off without it just looking like petty fury. First, receipts. Not just car receipts, but old bank receipts, copies of transfers, and a few paper trails that didn't add up if you knew what to look for. I've done freelance bookkeeping on the side since college, enough to know where to find oddities and ledgers. Whenever Dad wrote checks for the house or claimed repair expenses in private, I asked for copies under the pretense of helping organize family finances, which, to his credit, he never questioned because he liked the idea of me being useful. That gave me access to things he never thought I'd notice. Second, emails and texts. Over the last year, Dad and Ethan slipped into the habit of messaging each other about fronting cash or covering a client. Ethan, bless him, never used encryption. He sent photos of envelopes and admitted receiving cash in passing. Dad's voicemail transcriptions, which I'd quietly saved on my own cloud from the times he left memos on my phone while I was home, had a few lines that were telling. Nothing cinematic, just the kind of casual talk that, when put together with receipts, makes a pattern. Third, the physical stuff. Grandpa's lockbox had, for years, sat in the bench under the work table. I'd seen it as a kid and wondered what was inside. When I was 16, I'd gotten a glimpse and lied to myself that it was family keepsakes. Later, when Dad panicked about taxes and moved papers around, I noticed a missing certificate for a small parcel of land Grandpa owned. It was never discussed. Quiet things like that pile up, especially when you're the only one paying attention. So I made copies of everything I could. PDFs, scanned receipts, photos of the relevant pages of old ledgers, and a bunch of notes tying things together. I didn't take the originals. I never needed to. Originals can be misplaced by someone with a narrative to protect. Copies, on the other hand, are easy to distribute and almost impossible to pretend never existed if they are already out in a few trusted hands. That was the plan. Make copies and put them where they'd matter. I left a copy of the binder with a reliable friend of mine, a paralegal named Carlos who owes me a few favors and knows how to handle sensitive documents. I asked him, weeks earlier, to hold on to the binder with instructions. If I didn't check in within 48 hours of telling him I was leaving for a night, he was to forward the documents to a probate attorney I'd arranged, someone neutral, not family, and to the bank that handled Grandpa's accounts. He laughed when I first showed him what I'd collected, called it dramatic, but I told him this wasn't about drama. It was about making sure I had the option to act if they tried to steamroll me. He agreed. Then I packed a small USB drive with the crucial files, the scannable variant that showed a distribution Dad had been trying to keep quiet, a few bank transfers that didn't line up with what Dad claimed were repairs, and a short audio clip I'd recorded months earlier when Dad, complaining to himself in the garage, muttered something about taking care of the money for when he can't. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense, but it was enough to make someone with access start asking questions. I didn't leave that USB at my place. I placed it in the Honda, taped under the floor mat on the passenger side, and labeled it with a sticky note I knew Dad would read. If car is reassigned, see files. It was small, passive, and obvious enough to bait his curiosity without being aggressive. That brings me back to the garage that night. The car had my files. The car had my note. And, crucially, the garage, with its workbench and lockbox and camera, was where I knew he'd go first. He's a man who likes to inspect things personally. He likes to see what's happening before he spins a story. The morning they discovered the gap in the lockbox, they were distracted. They were looking for cash. That was a narrow focus, and it let them miss other things. While they were yelling and swapping accusations, I sat in my car outside and watched their patterns. I watched Ethan, who's all instinct and bravado, pace and make mistakes. I watched Dad, who thinks he commands the scene by raising his voice, steam, and overreach. People like them always do. When I saw Dad reach up and pull the security camera, that was the point where I knew they were panicking enough to cover tracks. That was the opening I'd spent months waiting for. A little before noon, as they were flustered, I texted Carlos a simple line, "Now." That was the trigger. I'd written him a clear note of what to do if I staged a little domestic upheaval and then disappeared for a night. He forwarded the files to the probate attorney, who, appreciating the pattern and the potential for wrongdoing, agreed to draft an emergency letter to the bank and to file a request to place a temporary conservatorship hold on the contested accounts pending investigation. These things aren't immediate or dramatic in the movies. They're slow, bureaucratic, and effective if the evidence is there. And the evidence was there, calmly sitting in my USB and binder. While that was quietly happening through channels I had set up, I went back into the garage. I didn't storm in. I opened the door and walked in like a man coming to collect his tools after a job. Dad froze and demanded to know why I was back. I said I needed to get my charger. Little lies that by a second, and sometimes that's all you need. I crouched by the passenger side and lifted the mat. The sticky note with my message caught Dad's eye. He moved toward me like a man stepping into something he'd rather not touch. I slipped the USB into my pocket and, deliberately and loudly enough for him to hear, asked if he'd found anything else in the box. His answer was terse, defensive. He didn't see the irony in the fact that he kept talking about taking care of family, as if that gave him a license to rewrite history. After I left, things moved quietly, but with a purpose I had set in motion. The attorney called Dad that afternoon with questions that made him curt. When he pressed for explanations, the bank placed a temporary flag on the accounts to review transaction anomalies, something they do more often than people realize, because banks hate unforeseen liabilities. Mom started calling everyone to say I was unstable, the old go-to-play to discredit people who push back. I let them talk. I wanted them to keep making their errors. People burn brighter when they try to outrun the truth. Then, late that afternoon, while Ethan was busy raving about how he'd fixed the car and how I'd ruined his job, a white sedan pulled into the driveway, and a man in a suit walked up the path. He carried a thin envelope and wore a businesslike look. Dad's face changed then, from anger to a sort of incredulous worry. I watched him through the garage window, the way you watch someone realize the rug under their feet is starting to come up. The lawyer I'd asked Carlos to call had shown up. He didn't stride into the house immediately. He stayed on the porch, professional, like he was delivering bad news. Dad wanted to send him away. He tried to charm, to sideline him, to make it personal, but the lawyer didn't care about charm. He asked questions in a soft voice, and then, when Dad couldn't answer them cleanly, he slid the envelope across to Mom and said, "We have records indicating there are transfers and documents that require clarification. We've placed a temporary freeze pending probate review. You and your family will receive formal notice." That sentence landed like a weight. Everything in the garage changed after that. Mom started to cry in that thin, desperate way she does when she knows the story she's told to everyone is unraveling in front of a stranger. Ethan, who had been thunderous all morning, went quiet. Dad's face drained into something I'd never seen. The look a man wears when he realizes the version of reality he's been selling has a hole in it. I stayed in the car because I wanted them to feel it. Not wildly, not theatrically, just the slow, cold realization that your safety net is being examined. I let the lawyer do his job. He handed Mom a notice, and while he spoke in legal terms, I could see Dad calculating what this would cost him. Money, reputation, stories he'd been telling for years. Before the lawyer left, he said something that sounded almost casual, but I could hear the weaponized civility in it. If anyone attempts to move or conceal assets during the review, let my office know. That's a crime. We'll escalate matters to the court. The phrase, attempts to move or conceal assets, had their names written all over it like a target. Once the lawyer was gone, the house collapsed inward. There were whispers, calls to relatives, and the kind of frantic bargaining that never looks good on anyone. I watched from my car as Dad went back into the garage and opened the lockbox again, now with shaking hands, and I heard him mutter something about he's gone too far to Mom. Ethan paced, whispering plans that sounded less like solutions and more like blame. They were unraveling in a polite, legal way, which is to say slowly, painfully, and in a manner that made them argue with professionals rather than me. That was the point. Later that night, when I finally went inside because I wanted to see the faces up close, Dad cornered me in the kitchen. He tried the old things: silence, disappointment, warnings about family. He said, "This is serious, William. You've made a choice you'll regret." It was the same line he always used, a threat wrapped in paternal concern. I told him calmly, "I made choices years ago. I decided to stop letting you make them for me." He didn't like that. He wanted to lecture, to make me feel small. I let him. I'd build a wall inside me that didn't allow guilt to seep through anymore. The real moment of escalation happened at dusk the next day. The house was quieter than usual, but the sense of impending things was thicker, the kind of hush that comes before a storm. I'd been expecting it, but not entirely sure when it would land. Then the phone rang. Carlos had forwarded me a text from the attorney. The bank had confirmed irregular transfers and wanted an explanation. The probate office had placed a temporary hold. They were going to audit the past 5 years of accounts. Dad went pale when he got the call. Mom's version of events started to fray as relatives chimed in with questions. Ethan, for his part, started to pivot from fury at me to fury at their own vulnerability. He spoke about lawsuits, about damaged reputations, about keeping the family name intact. They tried to rally allies, a cousin here, an old friend there, but the legal machinery has a way of isolating people one document at a time. And that's when I decided to step out from the car and do what I had planned next. Remember the USB? The one I'd left under the mat? I pulled it out at dusk, sat on the stoop, and for the first time I felt the weight of what I'd chosen. I could have made it public, thrown it online, and watched things blow up spectacularly. I could have slapped them with everything and walked away. Instead, I preferred a surgical approach. I wanted to shove a mirror in front of them and let the rest be handled by people who knew how to make paper and law do their work. I uploaded the files to a secure cloud and sent the link to Carlos, the attorney, and one carefully chosen cousin who is more honest than the rest. I attached a short, calm note. These are the documents proving the transfers and the will variant grandpa never meant to circulate. They are your proof. Use them wisely. Then I closed my laptop and walked back to the car. When I returned to the house, the front door was open. Voices muffled inside. Dad was in the garage again, staring at the emptied lockbox with a disbelief that looked almost like grief. He saw me, and for a second, the first honest second in a long time, he looked small. He said nothing. Mom's eyes were red. Ethan looked at me like I'd dealt a personal insult. The neighbors, who had once smiled at family barbecues, kept their distance like a collective audience watching the curtain come down. It was satisfying and terrible at the same time, because satisfaction tasted like the same quiet the house had always had, a silence built on rules they set for me. Then, the sound that made my throat tighten, a polite knock on the front door, and a man's voice asking for Dad by name. The kind of knock that meant officialdom. I watched the way Dad's shoulders tensed, the way his face arranged itself for explanations. And then the sheriff's deputy stepped in. He sat at the kitchen table, professional and steady, and asked for Dad's cooperation in a quick line of questioning. He needed to confirm bank records and was there to serve notice that the court had placed an interim hold. The deputy's tone was not accusatory. It was administrative, but administrative consequences are often the worst kind because they are methodical, slow, and effective. Dad tried to talk his way out of it, to call people, to insist on family privacy. The deputy folded his arms and said, with a kind of polite finality that hit Dad like a closing door, "Sir, you'll have the chance to explain it in court. For now, we just need to make sure no assets are moved while the review happens." It was a line my attorney friend had wanted. It was a line I had hoped for. It left them with a lot of loud air and fewer options. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched. The house felt like a stage after the play's final act was announced. The actors still moving, improvising lines, but the script had already been handed to a judge. Dad's face crumpled in private for a moment, a small private collapse. Mom whispered things about how we could fix it, how the family could band together, and Ethan muttered plans about what he'd do next. They looked like people scrambling to close a hole they'd dug for themselves. I didn't gloat. Not then. I simply felt the steadiness of decisions lining up with consequences. All of the work I'd done, the receipts, the emails, the audio, the binder, the paralegal, the attorney, the timed messages, had a single purpose: to make sure my family could no longer rewrite the past to suit their needs without someone asking the right questions. That's where I am now. The accounts are frozen temporarily. There will be hearings. People I thought I could trust will be subpoenaed. Relatives will be called to testify about what they knew and when. The house that used to be a place of suffocating favors is now under soft investigation. And yet, this is not the end. It can't be. Law moves slow, and people get clever. They will try to pivot, to spin, to whisper news stories. They will try to turn the narrative to me being ungrateful or unstable, which is their favorite old refrain. They will look for ways to obscure the trail and to paint themselves as victims. So I sat on my stoop tonight, watching the light in the garage go off and on, thinking through the next phase. I've done the part that requires patience and paperwork. I've set things in motion that use other people's systems, banks, lawyers, courts, to hold them accountable. But there's one more piece I haven't played yet. A move that is less about documents and more about reputation and truth in the neighborhood where stories get repeated. A move that will force Dad and Mom to explain, to answer in front of people they care about, not just faceless administrators. I won't tell you that move yet. Not here. Not tonight. Because revenge, if it's going to be clean and devastating, needs a last piece placed measuredly, like the final tile in a mosaic. And right now, the mosaic is almost complete. The deputy left with a polite promise to be in touch. The lawyer left, having done what I asked. Carlos messaged that he'd forwarded everything to a few more people who needed to see it. My phone buzzed with texts from a cousin asking if I'd do this for the rest of the family or if I was done. I answered something vague. I didn't want to be the one to narrate their downfall. I wanted the evidence to speak. I set the meeting for a Saturday afternoon, calling it a family reconciliation. That was intentional. It sounded harmless and would draw the exact audience I wanted. The cousins who'd been briefed, the neighbors who'd smiled at Dad, Mom's sister who always likes to mediate, and a couple of people from the community association who tended to gossip. I promised only what was comfortable: coffee, cake, and a place where we could all talk like adults. Of course, none of them knew the adults I'd arranged to have in the room. Carlos, my paralegal friend, the probate attorney, and a liaison from the bank. I told them there'd be paperwork to go over just to keep things transparent. They agreed. They always agreed when the word family or transparent came up. Dad walked in last, like he usually did, expecting the room to bow to his storyline. Mom hovered near the kitchen, face carefully neutral. Ethan came with loud confidence, until he saw the attorney and bank rep and realized this wasn't a casual chat. The rest of the room was a curious, slightly nervous audience. I started by being boring. I read the time and asked everyone to sit. Then I said, calmly, I have some documents to share. I placed the binder on the table, pushed the USB toward the attorney, and let him distribute copies to the bank rep and a cousin I trusted. The lawyer's expression was patient. He'd read this play before. He looked at me once, an almost imperceptible nod that said, "You did the right thing bringing this here." Then I let the evidence speak. First, the ledger copies. Detailed, annotated, with dates and amounts. Transfers labeled as repair costs that went into private accounts. Checks written in Dad's handwriting that paid out to an address Ethan occasionally used. Small amounts, one at a time, but over 5 years they added up. The bank rep confirmed the transfers on the spot. He had the authority to read the entries and the training to keep his tone neutral. He said, quietly, "These transfers are irregular. We will need to extend the review and notify the account holders." That sentence, once spoken in front of family, landed like a verdict. Next, the audio clip. It was short, Dad in the garage, recorded months ago when he thought he was alone, muttering about set some aside now, and when the time comes, he'll have his share. It wasn't dramatic on its own, but with the ledgers it was context. The lawyer played it for a quiet room. Mom looked away. Ethan's jaw worked. Then came the will variant. That file had Grandpa's signature, a dated codicil that redirected a portion of the estate to me specifically for what it called long-term responsibility and care. It was a small portion, not extravagant, but it was enough to show Grandpa's intent was not what Dad had been telling relatives. The lawyer explained the legal implication carefully. If a document exists with clear signatures and can be authenticated, it must be considered. He'd already filed preliminary paperwork with the probate court. The room grew colder. Dad tried his usual tricks. He smiled too much, reached for a voice that wanted to be conciliatory and authoritative at the same time. He attempted to explain the transfers as loans he'd made to Ethan and to cover a few things. The bank rep cut him off gently, saying the transfers showed no documentation as loans, no repayment schedules, and no notes. Ethan, who'd been verbally brash the day before, flinched when asked for receipts. He shifted, offered half excuses, then less confident ones as the lawyer calmly asked for timestamps and photos of envelopes he'd claimed. Mom started with the pity routine, eyes wide, small, apologetic, but that broke down when the cousin I'd trusted stood up and pointed out conversations he'd had with Mom months ago where she'd insisted, "We'll handle it for the family." The cousin's voice was steady, not wild. He said, "We don't do that in my household. If you take money from an estate, you call it what it is." The room hummed with that kind of quiet judgment, worse than any shouting ever could be. There was no single dramatic reveal. No one screamed, no one fainted. Real unravelings tend to be procedural and exhausting. Signatures verified by a third party, emails printed with metadata, bank timestamps confirmed by a representative who reads from a spreadsheet. The lawyer explained what the probate hold meant. The bank would freeze certain accounts pending full review. The court could appoint an independent administrator to handle Grandpa's estate. If misappropriation was proven, civil restitution would be pursued, and criminal referrals could be made. Dad's face went from smoke to ash. Ethan tried to bargain. He offered to repay amounts he didn't have. He started talking about reputations and jobs. The bank rep shook his head and said, gently, "We don't negotiate reputations. We reconcile accounts." That line made Ethan look suddenly small, which was the moment the room had been waiting for. After the formalities, when the lawyer asked for statements, Dad's story finally collapsed from its polite trousers. He stammered. He tried to reframe transfers as family support. The attorney, professionally unimpressed, read parts of the ledger and the audio aloud. Dad's voice thinned. He muttered something about being under pressure, aging, needing to protect the family. It sounded like rationalization, and that's not an excuse in front of a notary and a bank officer. I did not gloat. I answered questions succinctly. I told the truth. I said that I had found irregularities, that I had copies of records, that I had shared them with counsel because I wanted a fair legal process. I said Grandpa had meant things to be transparent. I said if the outcome proved I was right, I wanted restitution for what had been diverted, and I also wanted the legal appointment of an independent administrator. I said, finally, that I didn't want to be part of a family that treated honesty like an inconvenience. After the sit-down, the immediate consequences were practical and methodical. The bank extended the review period and froze contested accounts. The probate court accepted the preliminary filing and set a date for hearings. The lawyer filed an application for an independent administrator and requested a forensic accounting audit. The county sent a follow-up notice about potential criminal investigation if funds disappeared during the review. In plain language, the infrastructure of law moved to protect the estate from further tampering. Social consequences hit too. Word spread, because I quietly asked a cousin to text certain family members the condensed facts. Neighbors who'd once admired Dad's generosity now approached me with quiet questions. A few people asked if I'd been mistreated when I was younger, and those conversations rippled outward to a handful of mutual friends of the family who began to treat Dad differently. He lost the easy smiles. He lost invitations that had been habitual. The social cord that tied him to the neighborhood eased. That matters to a man who likes his audience. Ethan lost his job offer. The company he'd boasted about did a background and found the irregularities in his narrative, missing references, odd claims, and contact information that didn't check out. They rescinded their offer politely, but finally. For him, the crash was public in a way his tantrums never were. He started calling me later that week, voice small and insistent, but I didn't answer. Legally, the wheels kept turning. The independent administrator found that certain transfers lacked the necessary documentation to be loans or family gifts. The probate court demanded that Dad account for the funds. He couldn't. Under deposition, when asked about where the cash in Grandpa's lockbox had gone, he stammered, offered that it might have been used for family emergencies, and then produced inconsistent explanations. The judge ordered partial restitution and required Dad to sign an agreement to repay suspicious withdrawals over time, secured against a portion of the house. That meant the house would sit under a lien until the debt was satisfied. It was not zero-sum, but it was a public scar. The criminal aspect stalled longer. Prosecutors are careful and evidence-hungry, but the forensic accountant's report was not flattering. It recommended further inquiry into withdrawals that matched invoices for things that never happened. That report went to the district attorney. The DA's office opened a preliminary file. Investigation doesn't always end in charges, but the file exists now with a name attached to it. Dad's name. What I gained was also practical. Probate recognized the will variant and named an independent administrator. I was allowed to participate in hearings and to request certain restitutions for what I'd been deprived of. I got back enough to cover the upgrades I'd made to my car over the years, plus a modest compensation for emotional distress the court acknowledged in a civil finding. I took back the Honda. I fixed what I had altered, reinstalled some original parts, reclaimed a few pieces of myself that had been used as collateral for other people's laziness. I changed the locks on the house I'd been raised in, legally, because the lien and probate made ownership a mess, and I put a line of no contact in place. The family fractured. Mom retreated into quiet calls with relatives who still wanted to preserve family dignity, but their calls felt thin and increasingly absent. Ethan got loud on social media for a few days, blaming me indirectly and painting himself as the victim of sudden misfortune. But most people looked past the sound and read the documents. The cousins who had backed me stayed close. A few who had been sympathetic to Dad found their own consciences tugging them toward the evidence. And me? I moved out of the orbit. I sold the old Honda a few months later for a fair price, used the proceeds to pay legal fees, and set myself up for a quieter life. I invested in an apartment a reasonable distance away, changed my email and phone numbers, and let the legal apparatus handle the rest. I spoke at the hearings. I testified calmly about patterns I'd noticed and the files I'd compiled. I did not yell. I did not break. That was the point. In the end, the situation settled into a form that was clean enough for me. Dad had to account for funds, accept a lien on the house, and live with investigations that made neighborhood barbecues and prideful boasting impossible. Mom was left to answer relatives' questions and to sit with the knowledge that her role as mediator had been, at best, a cover for poor choices. Ethan lost his job prospects narrowed, and he had to start repaying whatever portion of the estate he was found to have taken or benefited from. The probate administrator allocated funds to correct the wrongs as best the law would allow, and the court ordered restitution and oversight. Criminal charges were possible. The DA kept the file open pending any new evidence, which meant Dad lived with the possibility of escalation. Socially and legally, they had been stripped of the easy narratives they used to hide behind. I did not forgive them. I did not reconcile. They had decades to choose the type of people they wanted to be. They had chosen to be selfish and then to rely on silence and habit to cover it up. I chose a different thing: transparency, consequence, and distance. That's not revenge in the petty sense. That's accountability. They were villains because they refused to act like adults when given resources that weren't theirs to manage. There was no dramatic final scene where I walked away in slow motion to triumphant music. There was a series of quiet, consequential moments. A lawyer sliding an envelope across a table, a bank officer reading a ledger, a judge placing a lien, a job offer rescinded. Those are small actions, bureaucratic and slow, but they add up to life change. Now, months later, the house still sits, but with fewer birthday lights and a fewer number of smiling neighbors. Dad keeps to himself. Mom calls sometimes, voice small and asking if we can talk. I don't return those calls. Ethan sent one desperate message asking for forgiveness and help. I archived it unread. The lawyer filed the final accounting, and the court closed the estate with orders for restitution. The DA's file remains open for now. The neighbors talk less about Dad's generosity and more quietly about what it means to be responsible in a family. I tell the story not because I enjoyed hurting them. I tell it because there is a kind of relief in letting law and facts do the work that used to be done by manipulation and habit. They learned that years of taking and covering have consequences. I learned that being slow and methodical can win where anger alone fails. And I learned to remove myself from people who chose villainy over accountability. So what happened in the end? Dad lost informal control of Grandpa's money, accepted a lien on the house, and now faces ongoing legal scrutiny. Mom's social standing within the family eroded, and her attempts to mediate are now recollected as enabling. Ethan lost his job and much of his credibility. The estate was put under an independent administrator, restitution was ordered, and the bank froze suspicious accounts. I reclaimed some of what was mine, set things in order, and cut contact. There was no forgiveness offered and none accepted, only facts, paperwork, and the slow machinery of law and social consequence turning in a direction the family had long avoided. That's the finish. It was not pretty in the way a movie makes it pretty. It was methodical, procedural, and devastating in a way that normalized their choices into real consequences. I don't miss them. I don't regret the steps I took. They had every chance to make different choices, and they didn't. Now they live with those decisions, and I get to live without them. If anything, the last thing I did was change the front porch light to a softer bulb and let the house's silhouette at night be a reminder that some places are safe to leave, not return to. The villains remained villains. The consequences remained in place. And I moved forward with fewer illusions and a clearer, quieter life. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.